Hello and welcome to Historic and Contemporary Issues in Indigenous Cultural Identity. This presentation addresses Indigenous health, education and learning programs. Historical and contemporary issues in Indigenous cultural identity have been affected by a history of government policies starting back as far as the 1930s with policies such as assimilation, integration, self-determination, multiculturalism, reconciliation, and closing the gap. These have all seen the disenfranchisement of Indigenous peoples and their alienation from human rights. The government's intervention program of 2012 sought to further dispossess landowners from their Indigenous heritage sites. Sacred sites are important to identity. This has threatened Indigenous identity structures as a strong sense of self-awareness, belonging, and purpose are derived from space. The programs associated with Indigenous cultural learning acknowledge this link and the traditional learning styles, building self-identity through learning on the land. All educational programs are focused on learning styles while considering educational strategies which take place in situ, on site. This strategy considers reciprocity, respect, belonging, and mutual acceptance. Education can take on many forms. Learning on country helps connect Indigenous communities' elders with the students and addressing contemporary issues of cultural preservation and land protection. This is done through communication with the community leaders. This maintains a strong sense of cultural values. The Learning on Country program identifies the needs in education and for the community, thereby stimulating identity-forming activities which are crucial to supporting Indigenous social issues. These educational programs attempt to bridge the problems created by closing the gap on Aboriginal disadvantage, which was a policy devised by the Rudd government in 2008. In 2015, another policy reviewed that policy and continued to misrepresent and position Indigenous peoples as deficient in health, education, and housing. To build cultural identity, Helen McCarthy suggests going bush for Indigenous peoples is a way of enjoying privacy and relief from sharing public spaces. Connecting with the land is a part of identity. Indigenous educational programs are aimed at correcting misrepresentations of Indigenous culture and re-establishment of cultural freedoms. Physical, social, and cultural well-being issues, such as identity, are enhanced by learning on country and other Indigenous cultural learning programs. The Dirimu Yolngu Youth Program is one of the 4 sites from Learning on Country. This particular site helps students consider their dreams and goals within the classroom independently. There are independent learning programs put forward, and the environment is always put first in the curriculum. This program empowers youth to explore their emotions and well-being and keeps culture strong by learning about history. A similar program, the Darug Country Community Program, focused on teaching histories and cultures. The retelling of stories builds identity and reconciliation to promote equality for Indigenous peoples and equal representation in educational settings. Some subject areas in the Learning on Country program are child studies, communication products, food and hospitality, communication and the community, workplace practices, numeracy for work and community life, art and the community. Identity is a sensitive issue pertaining to self-awareness and self-image. The lessons taught in the Darug Country curriculum cover dispossession in Australian history. The Learning on Country program uses regional names to identify people based on clan, place and peoples. For example, Murri, Guri and Boma. Language names may also be preferred. Gungari, Kuma, Jabakwi and Wiktananga. Identity and cultural knowledge are reflected in representations that are actively constructed by students as they learn in the Learning on Country program. An evaluation of the program has been conducted of the 4 sites. The evaluation aims at ensuring the holistic learning outcomes for Indigenous students. Short-term goals of the Learning on Country program are to produce a pool of literate and numerate work-ready participants. There is a strong anecdotal evidence that suggests cohorts are achieving progress in this regard. The Yirrkala Homelands schools saw benefits like being able to engage with custodians of the country and traditional landowners, and with rangers. The Learning on Country activities include studies of ancestral sites, protection of stingray sites, walks with stories and ownership of land histories, identification of stone tools. There are also identification of artifacts excursions, artifacts such as spear tips, back blades, scrapers and cores. Intergenerational knowledge transfer is a successful part of the Learning on Country program. Recognizing fauna such as the fire ant, a damaging species of invasive ant, is related to ecology studies. Marine debris management, weed management, preservation of traditional knowledge and hunting grounds, sacred site management, water monitoring, visitor management, fire management, feral animal control, terrestrial species monitoring, community awareness and knowledge sharing are all part of the Ranger program. Political uncertainty during 2013 and 2014 meant the commonness of education was being undermined by the government. Staffing was affected as there are two types of teachers in the model. The Homelands Education model involves community teachers living on the land and regularly visiting non-Indigenous teachers. Teachers are aware of the cultural information as intellectual property during consultation. Teachers negotiate payment for other specialist teachers from the school's budget. This is outlined in the Queensland Curriculum and Assessment Authority Handbook. To look at the evaluation of the Learning on Country program in 2012, 2013 and 2014, there was a number of students in the Learning on Country program participating, a few more than the non-Learning on Country participants. The Learning on Country program logic sets out the short-term and long-term goals of Learning on Country program. For short to medium-term goals, increasing student participation has seen limited progress. Further development of both ways learning outcomes has happened with consolidation in teaching and evaluation. Local governance and leadership has grown steadily since the beginning of implementation of Learning on Country program. Local goals are being clearly articulated over all 4 sites. Long-term goals such as 5C and 6C hope to find that they were reaching community goals through school programs, or at least move towards them. To monitor such goals, the evaluation needs long-term reflection. Because of the solid partnerships between rangers and the schools, Learning on Country seems to have a good capacity to meet those goals. The reason for this being also is the frequency of invitation of community members to be involved with the program. Unexpected progress has been made in reaching goals achieving pathways to employment. 6C. Local people in Learning on Country sites are employed, many of these in local community jobs. For example, 4 graduates made the transition from school to paid employment as rangers. Point 5C, an increased pool of confident, numerate and literate work-ready Indigenous peoples was a product of improved attendance and vocational engagement, the short-term outcomes of the Learning on Country program. These were some progresses made by integrating work placements with educational skill-based training. The final grades for the VET units for 2013-2014 saw 43% competency achieved with 12% continuing re-enrolment. Government policy failing to recognise issues of importance that value Indigenous knowledge are closing the gap on Aboriginal disadvantage, which is a good example of language of deficiency used to misrepresent Aboriginal culture. This policy, introduced in 2008, reviewed by another policy in 2015, continued to position Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples as deficient in health, education and housing as compared with non-Indigenous peoples. The Homelands Policy of 2009 also saw dispossession of the land in the Northern Territory region. The programs of Indigenous cultural learning, acknowledge the link between traditional learning styles and learning on the land. Using agentic language, an educator in an Indigenous learning program, such as Learning on Country, uses positive images which frame Indigenous people's potential and the community's goals and possibilities. The educators understand that Indigenous people's values are the foundation of a positive lifestyle. Learning on Country requires a number of factors coinciding to be effective: educational policy, school and community support, Aboriginal teaching staff, elders, non-Aboriginal teaching staff to be adaptive, and resources available for country visits, elders and specialist involvement. Learning on Country helps connect Indigenous communities' elders with students, addressing contemporary issues of cultural preservation and land protection. For some efforts in the secondary syllabus, history, geography, and Aboriginal languages, there still needs to be more ways of recognising how individual Indigenous cultures represent social values and religious beliefs, also covering the way cultural knowledge is passed and learning strategies such as oral communication, dance, kinesthetic traditions, and land rights. Educational strategies stem from the philosophy that the worldview of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders reaffirm their identity through educational practice. Learning on Country implicitly imparts belonging to the land. Although loss of cultural identity is a huge problem, this innovation seeks to address some of the strategies available to teachers and schools to empower Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to reaffirm identity through education. Learning and Teaching Initiative, outlined in the Learning on Country innovation, involves spiritual, physical, and social needs. Identity and cultural knowledge are reflected in representations the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples find and actively construct. These address the misrepresentations historically present. Difficulties the Learning on Country program has experienced are high turnover of staff due to loss of funding, periods of community unrest disrupting the program, unprecedented changes to policy and political landscape of the Northern Territory, such as the abolition of Aboriginal community councils in 2008. There has also been difficulties in defining and measuring teacher quality in a cross-cultural domain. Lack of infrastructure and equipment in remote schools for science education. Individual Aboriginal teachers have sought support outside of the Education Department due to lack of government support. Northern Territory government policy signals nothing clearly about the value of Indigenous cultural learning programs such as Learning on Country, or the allocation of resources needed to run an effective Indigenous cultural learning program. The benefits of the Learning on Country program are improved literacy levels as a result of stronger community engagement. Indigenous cultural learning programs provide the main entry point for science education, particularly ecological science. The knowledge base of Indigenous elders and programs impact on future sustainable natural and cultural resources for remote regions. Racial socialisation promotes positive mental health outcomes, reduces obesity and drug and alcohol use. The community has ownership over educational settings and control over decision making for the community based on Indigenous cultural learning programs. Culture is central to the program, including an understanding of local context, history, and community leaders. Local Indigenous staff work on the program and or in the organisation. Good corporate governance exists, and Indigenous staff are working on programs and existing capacity is harnessed. Trusting relationship with partners are established and flexibility in implementation timelines. The Darug country especially focuses on teaching histories and cultures. Belinda Murray teaches histories through language programs that have Aboriginal languages and community languages side by side in her classroom. This retelling of stories builds identity and reconciliation to promote equality for Indigenous peoples within educational settings. The responsibility of teaching histories remains the responsibility of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples only. Learning from elders is the only option for students within the educational setting. Invitations to events and consultation is part of the Learning from Country program to build identity. Thank you.